The security camera above the east corridor of Somerset Grace Hospital had recorded 11,000 ordinary hours before that morning. Nurses walking, gurneys rolling, nothing anyone would ever watch twice. It was about to record something no one in that hospital would ever be allowed to forget. Marina Vidal didn't know yet that she was walking toward the worst 30 seconds of her life. She only knew that the folder pressed against her chest felt heavier than paper had any right to feel, and that the man she'd married was about to show her exactly who he really was, on camera, in front of witnesses, with no way left to talk his way out of it. 4 years inside the Ethics and Compliance Office of Somerset Grace had taught Marina one thing above all: the most dangerous people rarely raised their voices. They smiled. They shook hands. They signed things in ink so clean it looked incapable of lying. That morning, 7 months pregnant, she walked the corridor with one hand at the small of her back and the other holding a slim gray folder like it was the only solid thing left in the building. The folder held 3 invoices. Different vendors, different letterheads, the same formatting error repeated 3 times, the same digital signature authorizing all of them. It also held a name: Laura Bennett, a patient who had gone in for a routine gallbladder procedure and never came home to her husband and 2 kids. Her file had been edited twice after her death, and the family had signed a confidentiality agreement negotiated personally by a woman named Camila Reyes, Somerset Grace's Director of Patient Relations, a woman with a soft voice, a practiced smile, and an intimacy with Marina's husband that Marina had stopped pretending not to notice. Eduardo Vidal was the hospital's chief executive officer. At dinner parties, he liked to describe his wife as brilliant but too gentle for the corporate world, and he always said it with a smile that made the room laugh warmly, protectively, at poor delicate Marina. Marina smiled too, because she had learned a long time ago that arrogant men mistook silence for permission. She had a 9 a.m. contract review scheduled, but she'd arrived 40 minutes early, because the night before, she'd heard Eduardo take a phone call out on the balcony, voice low enough that he thought she couldn't hear, but tense enough that she heard everything that mattered. That was new. Eduardo didn't get afraid. Eduardo made other people afraid. The restricted elevator required a badge. Only directors, auditors, and security techs had clearance to the 3rd subbasement, where the physical archive rooms sat beside the hospital's backup servers, records the administration liked to pretend didn't exist anymore. Marina swiped her badge, felt the short vibration of approval, and stepped inside as the silver doors slid shut around her like a mouth closing politely. On the ride down, she thought about her son. She still hadn't chosen his name, though Dr. Helena Cross, her obstetrician, kept insisting he needed one before he arrived. Marina had told her, half joking, that the boy needed a world he could breathe in first, one that didn't hand him lies as an inheritance. She hadn't told Helena about the investigation. She hadn't told anyone. But Helena had tired eyes of her own, the kind that recognized a woman quietly fighting a war. The doors opened onto air that felt 10 degrees colder than the rest of the hospital, and lighting that seemed to have no memory in it at all, flat, white, indifferent. The corridor was almost empty except for an abandoned housekeeping cart against the wall and the low electronic hum of the ceiling cameras. Marina walked slowly, listening to her own heels against the polished floor. When she turned the corner, she saw it, the archive room door standing slightly open, a blade of light cutting across the tile. She didn't panic. She breathed once, adjusted the folder against her chest, and leaned her ear toward the gap. Camila's voice came first, tight, stripped of the honeyed calm she used on grieving families. She was saying that Laura Bennett's file couldn't stay down here any longer, that the new security technician, Rafael Ortiz, had been auditing the camera system all week and could flag any after-hours movement. Eduardo answered with open irritation, calling Rafael an obedient little tech, calling Marina his exhausted wife, calling the hospital board a pack of old men starving for dividends. To him, apparently, everyone was a piece on a board. Marina felt something go cold in her stomach, not shock. Confirmation. She pushed the door open. Eduardo stood at the metal table wearing a white coat over his dress shirt, as if the fabric could still lend him innocence. Camila stood beside him gripping a records box to her chest, blonde hair falling loose from its clip, eyes going wide the instant she saw Marina in the doorway. For one full second, none of them moved, all three of them framed under cold fluorescent light and numbered shelving. Marina looked at the box. Then at her husband's face. There was no fury in her own expression, only a disciplined kind of sadness, which seemed to unsettle him far more than rage would have. "What are you doing down here?" Eduardo asked, like the room belonged to him and not to a hospital with rules that applied to everyone, including its own. "My job," Marina said evenly. "Unauthorized removal of sensitive patient files has to be reported immediately." Camila's grip on the box tightened. She looked at Eduardo the way a soldier looks at a commanding officer, waiting for the next order. He gave Marina a brief, almost fatherly smile, the smile he used when he wanted to turn a threat into a lesson. "You should be resting," he said. "Pregnancy and paranoia are a dangerous combination, sweetheart." Marina pulled her phone from her blazer pocket and touched the screen with her thumb. She said she was calling hospital security and the external compliance auditor, and that she'd be requesting preservation of the corridor's camera footage effective immediately. That was when Eduardo's face lost its polish. Something older surfaced under the smooth, dinner-party skin, something that had maybe always been there. He took a step toward her and said she was confusing marital problems with professional ones. Marina lifted her chin and told him that in this moment, she wasn't speaking as his wife. She was speaking as the person legally responsible for risks that could destroy lives. The sentence landed on him like an insult he couldn't forgive. He hated being contradicted by Marina in front of anyone, especially in front of Camila, who had always looked at him like he was untouchable. Camila's eyes flicked toward the open door, gauging the distance to the corridor. Marina noticed and shifted her body, quietly blocking the path. "Pregnant? Yes. Naive? No." She knew guilty people ran the moment they thought they could get away with something. "That box stays here until the technical team arrives," Marina said. Camila's voice came out thin. She said she was just following administrative orders, that she didn't understand why Marina was making a scene out of paperwork. Marina looked at her fully then, the flawless makeup over trembling skin, the delicate earrings, the manicured hands clutching evidence that could free a grieving family from years of enforced silence. "Did you tell Laura Bennett's mother the same thing?" Marina asked quietly, "when you handed her that agreement to sign while she was still crying in the ICU hallway?" The air in the room changed. Eduardo's jaw clenched. Camila's eyes dropped for a half-second too short to be called shame. Marina understood, in that instant, that she'd struck the exact center of their fear. Her son shifted inside her, a small, deliberate movement, like a reminder that courage was never the absence of risk. She pressed her palm flat against her belly without looking away from her husband's face. Eduardo saw the gesture, and for the first time, his expression flickered, not toward love, but toward calculation. He stepped closer, voice dropping low. He told her she had no idea what she was pulling on, that hospitals didn't survive on purity, that settlements prevented scandals and scandals destroyed jobs. He promised he'd explain everything at home, away from staff and cameras. "Our home stopped being a place for explanations," Marina said, "the moment lies moved into every room before I noticed." Camila took a step back. Eduardo saw it, and looked away from Marina to check on her instead. In that single second, Marina understood with brutal clarity exactly who her husband would choose to protect. And somewhere above them, mounted to the ceiling, its little red light blinking without judgment, the camera kept recording, the only witness in that room that couldn't be bought, couldn't be silenced, and would soon tear Eduardo Vidal's entire life apart. Her phone was still in her hand when Eduardo lunged for it. He moved fast, faster than she'd ever seen him move for anything that wasn't a camera or a board meeting. His hand closed around her wrist before she could finish dialing, and Marina felt the phone slip from her fingers and clatter somewhere behind her. She tried to twist away, one arm instinctively curling around her belly, shielding the only thing that mattered more than the truth in that folder. Camila didn't wait to see what happened next. She slid past both of them with the records box hugged to her chest, nearly stumbling over the housekeeping cart in her hurry to reach the corridor. Marina said her husband's name once, not a plea, not a question. A warning. "Eduardo." He shoved her shoulder to clear his path to the door. The world tilted. The fluorescent light overhead broke apart into smears of white. There was no cinematic slow motion, no dramatic scream, just a short, ugly, humiliating fall. Her hand hit the floor first, then her hip, then the rest of her body curling instinctively around the child inside her as she went down. The gray folder burst open, papers scattering across the tile like startled birds. For a few seconds, Marina heard nothing except her own pulse and a breathing that didn't sound like hers. Eduardo stood frozen above her. He didn't kneel. He didn't reach for her. He stood there, and his silence was worse than the shove had been, because it told her everything. He was already calculating the damage, not the danger. Already deciding how this would be explained rather than whether she was hurt. "I need Helena," Marina managed, her voice thin against the cold floor. Only when footsteps sounded from the far end of the corridor did Eduardo drop to a crouch beside her, his whole demeanor rearranging itself in an instant, concern slipping over his face like a coat he kept folded in his pocket for exactly this purpose. "She slipped," he called out. "Someone get a gurney, my wife slipped." Rafael Ortiz came around the corner first, badge swinging from his neck, a laptop bag half fallen off his shoulder. Whatever he'd been walking toward, he forgot it the second he saw Marina on the ground. His eyes went to Eduardo. Then, involuntarily, up to the camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. He didn't argue with Eduardo's version out loud. He simply crouched beside Marina and asked, low and steady, if she could feel the baby moving. She could, barely, and her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall in front of her husband. Rafael kept his voice level as he radioed the emergency line. "Pregnant woman down, third subbasement, archive corridor, possible obstetric emergency." "It was just a slip," Eduardo said, stepping in to correct him. Rafael didn't respond to that. He keyed the radio again and repeated the location, the time, and, deliberately, precisely, the fact that active cameras covered the corridor. Word moved through Somerset Grace with the strange, practiced speed of institutions that liked to pretend they were calm. By the time the gurney arrived, two orderlies pushing it like they were running against a storm no one else could see, Dr. Helena Cross was already coming down the hall in her surgical scrubs, dark hair still pinned under her cap, eyes sharp enough to catch a lie before she'd even heard the full sentence. She took Marina's pulse, checked her breathing, asked where it hurt. Marina answered with a precision that startled even Helena, because clarity was the last thing Eduardo expected from her in that state. Eduardo tried to take control of the scene. He said he'd accompany his wife, that he'd bring in the best specialists, that nobody needed to turn a domestic accident into an institutional emergency. Helena looked up slowly. "This hospital doesn't have domestic rooms in the third subbasement," she said. The sentence was quiet, professional, and impossible to argue with without sounding guilty. Marina almost smiled. The pain stopped her. Rafael quietly gathered a few of the scattered papers from the gray folder before one of Eduardo's security guards arrived, tucking them beneath his clipboard as if they were nothing but stray intake forms. In the elevator, Marina lay on the gurney, watching the lights slide past overhead. Eduardo held the side rail, playing the frightened husband with just enough polish to fool anyone who wanted to be fooled. Helena stood on the other side, her hand hovering near Marina's arm without quite touching it, respecting the dignity of a woman who had just been betrayed in public and still had a life inside her to protect. She noticed the marks already forming at Marina's wrist. The way she'd fallen. The absence of any scuff or slide mark on the sole of her shoe. None of it matched a slip. By the time they reached the obstetric emergency unit, Marina was surrounded by machines, hushed voices, and efficient hands. Then the sound filled the room, small, fast, insistent. Her son's heartbeat, thudding out of the monitor like a tiny act of defiance against everything that had just happened. Marina turned her face to the side, and only then did one tear slip free, sliding silently into her hairline. Helena studied the monitor and told her they'd run a full set of tests, no unnecessary rush, and no administrative interference. Eduardo understood the message clearly enough that his jaw tightened, but he still managed a smile for the passing nurse, preserving the mask in front of witnesses. While Marina was wheeled in for further monitoring, Eduardo called Camila 3 times from the hallway. She didn't answer. She was locked in a second-floor restroom, hiding the records box beneath a maintenance sink, hands shaking as she stared at it. Part of her wanted to run. Another part still wanted to believe Eduardo would fix everything, the way he always promised he would, between rushed kisses and long speeches about their future. But Camila also knew powerful men well enough to know they made generous promises and cowardly exits, and that the moment the fall started, they handed over whoever was standing closest. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of Marina. She was afraid of him. Down in the security office, Raphael sat in front of the monitors, his face unreadable. The footage was clean. No ambiguous angle, no convenient blur, no lighting failure to hide behind. Marina entering the corridor. The archive door standing open. Camila slipping out with the box. Eduardo's hand closing around his wife's wrist. The shove. There was nothing in that video that could be explained away as an accident. Raphael looked at the primary server, then at the mirrored backup drive. A failsafe almost nobody on the board even remembered existed anymore. Marina would remember. He would too. Eduardo appeared in the security office minutes later without knocking, flanked by 2 guards and a comm that felt more dangerous than any shouting could have been. He said they needed to isolate the footage immediately, citing patient privacy, warning that any unauthorized copy would be treated as a serious violation. Raphael answered that he'd follow the formal protocol, request logged, signed off by compliance and the external auditor. Eduardo leaned both hands on the desk and used Raphael's last name the way he used it with employees he wanted to shrink. He said careers had ended over excessive zeal before. Raphael felt something cold move through his chest, but he didn't look away. Before the conversation could get worse, his phone buzzed once on the desk. A message from Marina, sent from the gurney before she'd been wheeled into the exam room. For words on the screen. Preserve the 3rd subbasement. Raphael dismissed the notification before Eduardo could read it and made himself breathe slowly. Eduardo noticed the gesture but not what was on the screen. He ordered every camera feed from that corridor locked until further notice. Raphael nodded, opened the system in front of him, and executed exactly the kind of surface-level lockdown the manual allowed, while, in the background, the mirrored server quietly copied every second of footage into a separate, protected folder Eduardo didn't know existed. Eduardo believed power meant controlling the doors. He had no idea that his wife had just learned power meant something else entirely, knowing exactly which doors to lock behind you, and which key never to let go of. Because somewhere in a hidden folder on a server Eduardo Vidal had never once bothered to ask about, the truth was already safe. And it was only a matter of time before it came looking for him. Inside the exam room, every minute stretched like a rope pulled taut over a drop Marina couldn't see the bottom of. Helena explained, gently but without softening the truth, that the baby was stable for now, but that observation would be necessary. There was risk, and denying it would have insulted Marina's intelligence more than the fall already had. Marina thanked her for that honesty. Then she asked if Eduardo was still outside. He is, Helena said, in the tone of a woman who had already seen worse husbands in better suits. Marina closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her sadness had changed shape. It wasn't smaller. It had simply found a direction. Eduardo was allowed in once Helena permitted it, arriving with a bouquet bought from the hospital's own gift shop, a detail so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't so calculated. He pulled a chair close to the bed and spoke in the soft voice he saved for damage control, calling her sweetheart, saying everyone had just been rattled, that Camila had clearly misread the situation, that nobody needed to destroy an entire career over one confused moment. Marina let him finish without interrupting. She studied his hands, his shirt cuffs, the wedding ring catching the light like an object with no memory attached to it anymore. Then she asked where the box was, the one Camila had been carrying. His face hardened for less than a second, but Marina knew every crack under that mask by now. He said he didn't know anything about a box. Maybe some administrative files, nothing important. Maybe she was confused because of the pain. Maybe it would be better if she focused on the baby. Each maybe pushed her a little further, not toward the floor this time, but toward an old, familiar cell, the one so many men built for lucid women, calling their clarity hysteria. Marina turned her face to the window and told him the baby was exactly the reason she wasn't going to stop asking. Outside, Helena crossed her arms as she watched Eduardo leave the room wearing offense like a second bouquet. She didn't care for hospital politics, but she knew hospital politics had a way of walking straight into patient rooms, patient files, and patient futures whether anyone invited it in or not. Near the coffee machine she found Raphael, pale, gripping his clipboard too hard. He didn't say everything. He only told her there was a preserved copy of the footage, and that Marina needed to know. Helena glanced around, measuring cameras, doors, and listening ears, then said that in this hospital, sometimes a patient's life depended on who knew how to keep quiet. That night, alone for the first time, Marina lay listening to the hum of machines and the city glittering indifferently beyond the window. Indifferent to a woman's fall, a mother's fear, the quiet collapse of a marriage half the hospital still envied. She rested her hand on her belly and felt a small, answering movement, as if her son were responding to a question she hadn't dared ask aloud yet. She didn't promise herself revenge. The word felt too small for what was beginning inside her. She promised herself truth. She promised that Eduardo would learn the difference between knocking someone down and actually being able to keep them there. Down in the hallway, Eduardo was already on the phone with the board chairman, using clean sentences to dirty the truth. He said Marina was emotionally overwhelmed, that the pregnancy had worsened old insecurities, that it might be wise to limit her access to sensitive files pending a medical evaluation. He didn't know Helena was standing close enough to hear the shape of his next weapon. He didn't know Raphael, on another floor, was quietly sending an encrypted copy of the footage to a secure destination outside the building's network. Eduardo still believed power meant controlling doors. Marina already understood that power meant knowing which keys to keep. Past midnight, Marina asked the night nurse for paper and a pen. She wrote names, timestamps, access codes, and questions that would need answers before Eduardo realized the size of the disaster closing in on him. Her handwriting came out shakier than usual, but every line carried the precision of someone who had walked through pain without surrendering command. At the top of the page she wrote Laura Bennett. Below it, Camila Reyes. Below that, Eduardo Vidal. There was no anger in the order of the names. There was method. And method, Marina knew, was the most patient form of courage there was. Morning arrived without gentleness, spilling pale light across the white sheets and the monitors still tracking her son's heartbeat. Marina had slept little, caught between the ache in her hip, the memory of the fall, and the invisible weight of Eduardo somewhere just outside the door. Helena came in before 7, a medical folder pressed to her chest, wearing the look of a woman who'd spent the small hours organizing hard questions. She didn't open with comfort. She said the tests showed the baby was stable, no immediate signs of distress, though observation had to continue given the risk of contractions and the trauma to Marina's body. Marina listened with her eyes fixed on the monitor, as if every beat were a renewed agreement with life itself. When Helena mentioned the bruising on her wrist and how it matched a lateral force rather than a slip, neither of them needed to say Eduardo's name. The truth was already in the room, breathing quietly between them. On the other side of that door, the hospital had already begun rehearsing a fabricated version of events. Eduardo had gathered assistants, department heads, and a communications consultant in the 5th-floor administrative suite. He spoke of family privacy, of an unfortunate episode, of protecting the institution's image during a sensitive moment. Nobody said shove. Nobody said Camila. Nobody said missing file. The chosen words were too clean, too tidy, like flowers arranged over a crack in marble. Eduardo understood the power of language, and trusted it almost as much as he trusted fear. The first internal memo went out before 9 a.m., signed by the operations office. It stated that a pregnant employee had suffered an accidental fall in a technical area, was receiving all necessary care, and that her privacy would be respected. Marina read it on her phone, forwarded by a rattled colleague, and felt no surprise. What she felt was a slow, gathering coldness replacing the humiliation. Eduardo wasn't trying to protect her from a domestic crime. He was trying to convert an assault into administrative background noise, a betrayal into an incident, A wounded woman into an obstacle to business continuity. Helena watched Marina read it and quietly closed the door. She said the memo had gone out too fast to be innocent. Marina agreed, her voice staying low. She asked Helena to document everything with clinical precision. No adjectives, no concessions. Pain in the right hip. Abrasion on the wrist. Bruising on the forearm. No account from the patient consistent with accidental slipping. Helena raised an eyebrow at the clarity of the request. Marina explained that Eduardo would attack her credibility before he ever attacked the evidence. They needed to leave him no clean ground to plant a lie on. Meanwhile, Raphael sat in the basement tech office surrounded by monitors, cables, and a silence stretched tight enough to hum. The backup copy of the footage had already gone to an encrypted drive outside the main server. But that wouldn't be enough. Eduardo had the authority to order fake audits, sudden terminations, equipment replacements, disguised as routine maintenance. Raphael pulled up old service logs and noticed something that made his stomach drop. Footage wipe requests had been filed 3 times in the past 6 months, always right after meetings involving Camila Reyes. His fear deepened. So did something else, a bitter, stubborn loyalty. Raphael owed Marina more than professional courtesy. 2 years earlier, when a vendor had tried to accuse him of taking kickbacks for refusing to sign off on faulty equipment, it was Marina who'd pulled every contract and proved his innocence in front of a board more than willing to sacrifice a technician to protect an executive. She hadn't raised her voice that day. She'd simply opened the right documents in the right order until the liars ran out of places to hide their hands. Since then, Raphael had believed that justice sometimes wore the shape of a quiet woman with a well-organized folder. Eduardo walked into the tech office just before 10, flanked by Walter Briggs, the head of hospital security, a man known for smiling only at people above him on the org chart. He demanded raw access to the 3rd sub-basement footage. Raphael told him the files were locked under critical incident protocol involving a patient in a restricted area. Walter rested a hand on the back of a chair and asked, almost pleasantly, since when a technician got to decide protocol. Raphael's throat went dry. But he answered that he wasn't deciding anything, he was following rules the executive committee itself had approved. Eduardo didn't like hearing his own system used against him. And the threat that came next arrived wearing the mask of concern, soft-spoken, reasonable, and far more dangerous than anything he could have shouted. Eduardo said he understood Raphael's diligence, but that footage of a vulnerable pregnant woman shouldn't be circulating among curious staff. He added, almost gently, that Marina needed to be protected, even from people who might misread what they saw. Raphael looked at the locked file on the screen and thought that men like Eduardo called it protection when what they were really doing was locking the victim in and letting the man who hurt her walk free. He signed the acknowledgement of the administrative order, handed over an incomplete access log, and kept the mirrored systems trail hidden. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. In her room, Marina received a visit from her mother, Celeste, a retired schoolteacher who wore the face of a woman who'd already cried in the elevator and pulled herself back together before walking through the door. Eduardo had called her first, naturally, offering the story of a slip, framing it around nerves, exhaustion, and Marina's imagination. Celeste crossed to the bed, touched her daughter's hair, and asked only one question. Did he do this? Marina closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said yes. Celeste didn't scream. She didn't curse his name. She simply held her daughter's hand harder. She'd known Eduardo for 8 years, long enough to understand that elegance could be a polished form of cruelty. She remembered the dinners where he corrected Marina in front of guests, always smiling, always wrapping small put-downs in something that passed for affection if you weren't paying attention. She remembered how he chose the menu, the vacations, the acceptable friendships, even the best hour for Marina to rest. The fall in that basement hadn't come from nowhere. It was simply the first visible violence in a long architecture of diminishment. That realization hurt worse than any surprise could have. Marina asked her mother not to confront Eduardo. Celeste wanted to argue, but Marina held her hand and explained that powerful men fed on disorganized reactions. If Celeste shouted, he'd call it family hysteria. If she threatened him, he'd request a restraining order against her. If she cried in front of hospital staff, he'd use the tears as proof of instability. Celeste listened, jaw tight, understanding that her daughter was speaking like a lawyer to keep from falling apart like a wife. In the end, she agreed. She promised to keep her anger somewhere Eduardo couldn't photograph it. That afternoon, Camila sent the first message. Marina was alone, watching thin rain streak the window, when her phone buzzed against the sheet. The text said she should think about the baby before destroying Eduardo's career. The second message followed, sharper, that certain women confused marriage with ownership and ended up putting everyone at risk. Marina read both without responding. There was no apology in them. No human fear for the child who could have been hurt. Only arrogance, and underneath it, urgency. Camila was trying to intimidate someone she imagined was already broken. Marina took screenshots, saved them into 2 separate folders, and forwarded everything to a secure address she used for internal investigations. The third message arrived minutes later, and its single line made her whole body go still. Laura Bennett's family was desperate too. In the end they understood it was better for everyone. Marina read it 3 times. Camila had just tied her own hand directly to the case that was supposed to stay separate. She wasn't just Eduardo's mistress. She was operational. Helena returned to the room and found Marina sitting upright despite the order to rest. Marina showed her the messages. Helena read them in silence, her expression shifting slowly from outrage to strategic focus. She said Camila sounded scared, and scared people talked too much when they still believed they had leverage. Marina agreed, and asked Helena not to repeat any of it, not even to trusted colleagues. Trust, right now, had to be given out in careful layers. In the patient relations office, Camila tried to keep her composure intact. She handled 2 families with her usual practiced warmth, briefed a receptionist about flowers for a VIP room, and declined Eduardo's call for the 5th time. Her mind kept replaying the image of Marina falling, not from guilt, but from a colder fear, that the camera might have caught the moment clean, with no shadow left to negotiate inside. She'd always believed Eduardo could bend any version of reality he wanted. Now she wondered if he'd bend her too, reducing her to a disposable mistake. He found her eventually in the executive's break room, pretending to review a spreadsheet. He closed the door and asked if the documents were secure. She said yes, but wanted to know about the footage. He told her everything was under control, but he avoided her eyes when he said it. She knew that particular evasion. It was the same look he used right before lying to Marina at a public event. A chill moved up her arms. She asked if he'd protect her if anyone started investigating Laura Bennett. Eduardo stepped closer and told her never to say that name again. The order, instead of calming her, spiked her panic higher. Camila realized he wasn't speaking like a worried lover anymore. He was speaking like a director containing a leak. He told her Marina was emotionally fragile, that everyone would understand, that a betrayed pregnant wife might invent narratives out of humiliation. Camila heard the word betrayed land like a slammed door. Until then, Eduardo had always sworn the marriage was already dead, that Marina was just a necessary front, that the divorce would come whenever the timing was convenient. Now he spoke about his wife with contempt, while still using her as the center of his entire strategy. Late in the afternoon, Raphael made his way to the obstetric wing without drawing attention. He carried a bag of fruit to look like an ordinary visitor, though his hands gave away the tension underneath. Helena intercepted him before he reached the door and steered him into an empty exam room. There, Raphael confirmed the footage existed, was secured, and showed the shove without ambiguity. Marina listened from an armchair, a blanket over her shoulders. She didn't celebrate. Proof didn't erase pain. It only kept the pain from being buried under a convenient version of events. Raphael also mentioned the old footage wipe requests tied to meetings involving Camila. Marina asked for dates. He read them off his phone, and she recognized 2 immediately. One matched Laura Bennett's death. The other lined up with the sudden transfer of a surgeon to a distant facility, right after an internal complaint that had somehow never reached the board. The pieces were forming a picture bigger than infidelity. Eduardo hadn't just wrecked a marriage. He might have built an entire system where medical error, money, and reputation walked arm in arm through sterile corridors. The hard part now was turning suspicion into proof without alerting the whole network. Marina explained that Eduardo would be watching for an emotional reaction, a separation request, a public accusation. He wouldn't be watching for organized silence. So that was exactly what she intended to give him. That night, Eduardo returned with an outside lawyer named Marcus Fielding, a specialist in corporate crisis and quiet settlements. Marina recognized the type immediately. Eduardo framed the visit as preventive care, saying the hospital wanted to ensure the family's peace of mind. Marina let them talk. Fielding suggested a temporary leave of absence for her, full paid time off, and a later review of any misunderstanding. The word misunderstanding hung in the room like an insult. Marina rested her hand on her belly and asked whether the agreement also included destroying the footage, or just making it irrelevant. Fielding's polish cracked for exactly 1 second. Eduardo tried to step in, but Marina raised her hand and cut him off without raising her voice. She said she wouldn't be signing anything while hospitalized, medicated, and under obstetric observation, and that any attempt to obtain her consent in that state would be documented as coercion of a vulnerable patient. Helena, called in by Marina minutes earlier, walked into the room at that exact moment and asked whether there was any medical justification for this meeting. The lawyer understood the risk and closed his folder. Eduardo smiled with his teeth pressed together. Marina saw hatred behind that smile. And she understood, with total clarity, that whatever came next, Eduardo Vidal was no longer negotiating from a position of strength. He just hadn't realized it yet. After they left, the pressure in the hallway thickened. Walter Briggs was seen questioning nurses about who was coming and going from Marina's room. The communications consultant drafted a more detailed statement for the board, painting Eduardo as an attentive husband and Marina as an overworked professional buckling under strain. Camila deleted old messages, forgetting that Marina had already saved the recent ones. Raphael noticed and attempted remote access to the locked files and quietly took a backup route offline, citing technical instability. The hospital looked spotless from the outside. Underneath, it groaned like a ship in a storm no passenger could see yet. Marina didn't sleep before dawn. The physical pain had eased, replaced by something sharper and clearer. She replayed every gesture Eduardo had made over the years, every compliment with a blade tucked inside it, every piece of advice that had quietly pushed potential allies away, every public display of affection that made her look ungrateful if she ever disagreed. The fall had revealed the final violence. It had also lit the way back. She wasn't the fragile woman from the internal memo. She wasn't the confused wife from his version of events. She was a witness, a victim, and a strategist, all three at once. Around 2 a.m, her phone lit up with one last message from Camila. This time, no direct insult, just a short line, written maybe out of fear, maybe out of vanity. You'll never prove what happened to Laura without the files that disappeared. Marina's heart sped up. It was a confession dressed as a threat. She saved it, forwarded it to Raphael, and asked him to check old access logs on Laura's physical file. Then she set the phone down and watched her son move beneath her skin. Eduardo had chosen a war, believing he was facing a woman already on the ground. At sunrise, Marina asked Helena to prepare her discharge the moment it was medically safe. Helena hesitated, then understood without needing it spelled out. The room protected Marina, but it also kept her surrounded by walls her husband still controlled. She needed to step outside his territory to see the whole board clearly. Helena promised to move within medical limits, without rushing anything unsafe. Marina nodded. Through the window she watched staff crossing the parking lot under dark umbrellas, each of them carrying a life that might never know the rot sitting in the building's command chain. She couldn't afford to look away from it any longer. That same morning, Eduardo received confirmation that the primary video file was locked, inaccessible without dual authorization. Walter suggested replacing the server under emergency maintenance. Eduardo declined for now, wary of drawing the auditor's attention. He still believed he controlled Raphael, Helena, Marina, and Camila, for people he evaluated separately and underestimated for 4 different reasons. He didn't understand that the fall had created a silent alliance among the very people he considered weak, technical, sentimental, or disposable. His arrogance still felt like intelligence to him. That was the exact error Marina intended to let keep growing. Before closing her eyes for a few minutes, Marina received a single frozen frame from Raphael. The image showed Eduardo's hand locked around her wrist, her body already tilting off balance, Camila slipping away in the background with the box. The picture was terrible. It was also freeing. For the first time since the fall, Marina cried without shame, not because she felt defeated, but because the truth finally had a face and no one could call it invention anymore. She took a breath, touched her belly, and whispered that they were still here. And as long as they were, Eduardo would not win. Marina left Somerset Grace on a sunless morning, sitting in the back seat of Helena's car with Celeste beside her and a small bag resting on her knees. The discharge had come with strict instructions: rest, hydration, immediate return at any sign of unusual pain. But the instruction Helena never wrote down was the one that mattered most. Don't go home to a house where he controls the doors. Marina agreed without drama, watching the hospital shrink in the rearview window, still imposing, still gleaming, still a palace hiding basements full of muffled voices. Eduardo expected her to return to their apartment, where drivers, doormen, and longtime staff would report her every move. Instead, she went to Celeste's house, a modest one-story home on a tree-lined street, with pale walls, the smell of brewed coffee, and family photographs Eduardo had always called excessively sentimental. Nothing there was luxurious. Everything there had memory. At the door, Marina touched the frame like someone crossing a border. Her body ached, her belly felt heavy, but for the first time since the fall, she breathed without feeling her husband's shadow pressed against her back. Celeste made soup, fluffed pillows, and tried to hide her fear behind small tasks. Marina let her, because some mothers loved best by rearranging drawers when the world threatened to collapse. Helena checked in by phone, monitoring her blood pressure, reminding her that no investigation was worth a premature contraction. Marina said she knew. It wasn't bravado. She understood she was carrying two missions now, saving her son and saving the truth, and that the two depended on each other, because Eduardo would only stay dangerous as long as silence and prestige kept protecting him. Raphael arrived at dusk without his uniform, wearing a low cap and a plain backpack. He brought digital copies, access lists, deletion logs, and 3 pages he'd rescued from the gray folder the day of the fall. He sat at Celeste's kitchen table like a man about to confess a crime, though all he'd really done was refuse to look away. Marina opened Celeste's old, slow laptop, safely outside the hospital's network, and each file appeared on the screen like a fragment of a darker map. Ledgers, names, authorizations, transfers, settlements. Eduardo's presence ran through nearly all of it, even in the files he'd never personally signed. They started with Laura Bennett. 36 years old, 2 young kids, admitted for what was supposed to be a routine gallbladder surgery. The original chart noted an adverse reaction to anesthesia and a delay in emergency response. The final version, filed after the settlement, described an unforeseeable pre-existing condition. Between the two, there was a login window tied to one of Camila's administrative credentials. Raphael showed the trail like it was his own personal failure. Marina simply took notes. Systems failed because powerful people trained them to obey. Deep into the night, after Celeste finally fell asleep on the couch, Marina kept reading. Her son moved with steady insistence, and every time a line on the screen stole her breath, she pressed a palm to her belly to steady herself. She discovered that Camila had visited Laura's family before the final medical report was even issued, bringing flowers, offering grief counseling, quietly preparing the ground for the settlement. The signature from Laura's mother, shaky and uneven, sat beside a confidentiality clause so airtight it read less like comfort for a grieving family and more like a shield built to protect an empire. Across town, in the empty apartment, Eduardo paced through rooms that seemed to mock him with their silence. He found Marina's closet half-emptied, personal documents gone. The quiet didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like defiance. He called Celeste, no answer. He called Marina, let it ring out. Then he sent a carefully worded text about acting like adults for the sake of the child. Rereading his own sentence, he felt a strange pride in his own restraint. He didn't see himself as an abuser. He saw himself as a man cornered by an ungrateful wife and a careless mistress. The next morning, Marina discovered their joint card had been frozen. The shared investment account showed a hold, justified as preventive asset review. Eduardo had moved fast. He wanted her to feel the walls of dependency closing in, wanted her to remember that Celeste's modest house came without private doctors, cribs, or security. Marina closed the banking app without surprise. She'd been expecting the financial strike, even if the precision of it still stung. Celeste was furious, but Marina said it was useful. Every abuse revealed his strategy and added one more line to the case they were building. Eduardo didn't stop there. That afternoon, Celeste received a visit from a distant cousin, Alvaro, a vain man who admired Eduardo's social standing. He arrived with the voice of a peacemaker, saying Marina needed to think about the baby, that scandals were cruel, that brilliant men sometimes made mistakes under pressure. Celeste nearly threw him out before he finished his coffee. Marina, however, appeared in the hallway and let him talk until the end. Then she asked whether Alvaro would also call it pressure when a hospital director shoved a pregnant woman to the floor to let his mistress escape with evidence of a patient's death. He left without saying goodbye. The visit confirmed one thing. Eduardo was trying to surround Marina through family before she could surround him through the law. That same night, an anonymous note began circulating among board members, suggesting the internal council had been showing unstable behavior, persecutory obsessions, and severe marital conflict. A sympathetic director forwarded it to Marina, shaken. The message was cold, elegant, and built to destroy reputations with velvet gloves. Marina recognized the phrasing immediately. It read exactly like Marcus Fielding's work. She saved the message and kept working, the old familiar sting of humiliation rising and then, deliberately, being set aside. Helena had become something more than a doctor by then. She visited daily under the excuse of obstetric follow-up, but she also carried news from the hallways. Nurses had been quietly instructed not to discuss the fall. Walter was asking too many questions about Raphael. Camila had requested stress leave and returned the same day, right after a private meeting with Eduardo. Helena was afraid of losing her position, but the fear didn't make her small. She had watched too many poor patients get crushed under legal language. Too many mothers sign papers they didn't understand. Too many colleagues choose comfort over truth. Standing in front of Marina now, she chose not to look away. The name Sofia Delgado surfaced on a rainy afternoon while Marina was reviewing a list of cases closed through fast, quiet settlements. Sofia was a district prosecutor, known for her coldness in court and her refusal to accept political favors. She'd also been Marina's closest friend in law school, before a painful falling out over a lawsuit involving a clinic connected to Eduardo's father. Back then, Marina had believed Sofia was exaggerating claims of influence and cover-up. Now the memory came back as a debt. Celeste noticed her daughter's hesitation and said pride never rocked a baby to sleep, and it never brought down criminals either. Marina called. Sofia picked up on the third ring, without enthusiasm. A heavy silence followed, the kind that carries years of unsaid sentences. Marina didn't open with an apology, because an apology without facts could sound like strategy. She said only that she needed help outside the hospital, that there was an assault caught on camera, and evidence of record tampering tied to deaths and secret settlements. Sofia went quiet for a few seconds. When she spoke, her voice was controlled. She asked if Marina had proof, or just the pain of a betrayed wife. The question hurt because it was fair. Marina answered that she had the video, Camila's messages, access trails, and partial documentation on Laura Bennett. She admitted she also had fear, but she said she didn't confuse fear with evidence. Sofia exhaled on the other end, and in that sound, Marina heard her old friend wrestling both old resentment and the weight of the case. The prosecutor set a meeting away from any government building, a quiet university library. Before hanging up, she warned that if this was some backdoor attempt to weaponize a divorce with criminal charges, she'd shut it down immediately. Marina said she wanted justice, not leverage. The meeting happened 2 days later. Helena authorized a short outing under strict conditions, and Raphael mapped the route to avoid familiar drivers. Marina arrived in a dark dress and low shoes, walking slowly. Sophia was waiting at a table in the back, hair pulled tight, face bare, eyes too sharp for any lie to survive. When she saw Marina's belly, her expression softened for an instant before hardening again. Marina didn't ask for sympathy. She opened her laptop, pulled up the files, and let the truth speak before she did. Sophia watched the video without interrupting. Eduardo's hand around Marina's wrist. Camila slipping away. The shove, unbearably clear. The prosecutor breathed slowly through her nose, the same habit she used in courtrooms to keep outrage from contaminating method. Then she read Camila's messages, the access logs tied to Laura's file, the deletion requests, the duplicated invoices. When she finished, she rested both hands flat on the table and looked at Marina. She said there were enough elements to open a quiet inquiry, but also real risk. Eduardo had influence, expensive lawyers, and a network that would respond with institutional violence. Marina accepted that without flinching. Then Sophia asked why she should trust her now, after years of standing beside the Vidal family while old complaints got buried. The question opened a wound Marina had avoided too long. She admitted she had confused love with loyalty, polish with character, closeness with knowledge. She said Eduardo hadn't fooled her alone. She had chosen not to see certain shadows too, because the light of the marriage had seemed like enough. Sophia listened without triumph. In the end, she said regret didn't absolve anyone, but it could start something useful. When Marina got home, a preliminary legal notice was waiting, sent by Eduardo's lawyers. It spoke of protecting the well-being of the unborn child, suggested a psychological evaluation for Marina, and floated the idea of measures to shield the baby from a conflicted family environment. Celeste only made it halfway through before her hands started shaking with rage. Marina read every line. Eduardo was laying groundwork to fight for control of the child, possibly before he was even born. The cruelty was sophisticated but predictable. He would turn her motherhood into proof of her fragility, if she let him. That night, Marina cried sitting on the closed lid of the bathroom toilet, the faucet running to hide any sound. She didn't cry for Eduardo. That part of her was dying slowly and cleanly. She cried for her son, not yet born and already being used as a pawn in a reputation war. She cried for Laura Bennett, for deceived families, for women called unstable the moment they dared to describe their own fall. Then she washed her face, sat back down, and wrote a legal response so calm it read like it had been drafted out of ice. Sophia began the first quiet moves, requesting external preservation of records, consulting a detective who specialized in institutional crime, pulling financial records without openly naming Eduardo yet. Rafael, guided by Marina, stopped accessing new files and simply protected the metadata he already had. Helena documented every attempted interference with the chart. Celeste screened family calls, answering with short, neutral sentences. The plan moved like water, soaking into concrete, without spectacle, but with persistence. Eduardo expected an explosion. He got silence instead. And silence, for men like him, was unbearable. Camila resurfaced when no one expected it. She sent Marina a short voice message, deleted almost instantly, but Rafael managed to recover the notification and guide its retrieval from the device. Her voice trembled as she said Eduardo had promised to handle Laura, the settlements, and the fall, but was now talking about pinning everything on subordinates. Marina listened twice. There wasn't enough remorse in it to clear her, but there was enough fear in it to crack Eduardo's armor. Sophia, receiving the file, said guilty people could still make useful doors. Marina answered that useful doors still needed to be opened carefully. Eduardo, for his part, was beginning to feel small losses of control everywhere. Camila was unstable. Rafael too formal. Helena too resistant. Marina too silent. The board still backed him, but a few members were quietly asking about the fall and about delayed financial audits. He blamed Fielding for a slow strategy. He blamed Camila for recklessness. He blamed Marina for ingratitude. He never once blamed himself. In his bathroom mirror, straightening his tie, he saw not a cornered man but a commander temporarily inconvenienced by disobedient soldiers. That blindness was his last real protection. By the end of the week, Sofia gave Marina a decisive piece of guidance. They needed to provoke Eduardo into acting without letting him sense the true scope of the investigation. A man used to winning through fear tended to reveal more when he believed he was simply buying surrender. Marina understood immediately. She would request a private meeting, not as a desperate victim, but as a wife willing to negotiate silence in exchange for financial security and protection for her son. Celeste protested. Helena hesitated. Raphael went pale. Marina looked at each of them and thanked them for it. Then she said she wouldn't be walking into a trap alone. She would make Eduardo believe the trap was his. The night before she sent the message, Marina sat in the bedroom that had been hers as a teenager, looking at old faded stickers along the edge of the bookshelf. She thought about the young woman who'd studied law believing justice was a straight line. She thought about the woman who'd married Eduardo believing love could survive unequal admiration. She thought about the mother now forming inside her, sterner and freer than any earlier version of herself. She touched her belly, felt her son answer, and smiled through sadness. Eduardo had pushed her down in front of a camera. From that moment forward, every camera, every document, and every silence in that building was going to work against him. Marina sent the message to Eduardo at 8 in the morning, after reading each word over like someone defusing a bomb. She offered no apology, made no accusation, and never mentioned the footage. She said only that she was open to discussing a quiet separation, provided there were financial guarantees, protections for the child, and a formal end to any narrative painting her as emotionally unstable. Eduardo replied in under 5 minutes. The speed confirmed the hunger. He scheduled a meeting for the end of the day in the board's private conference room, convinced Marina had finally chosen survival over war. Sofia received a copy of the exchange and told Marina, in no uncertain terms, not to improvise. No insults. No threats. No language that could later be twisted into extortion. Eduardo needed to talk out of vanity, not out of provocation. Raphael, with legal authorization from the prosecutor's office, set up a secure monitoring channel tied to the meeting. Helena insisted Marina bring water, her approved medication, and an exit route in case of any contraction. Celeste wanted to walk her right up to the door, but Marina gently refused. Some crossings needed invisible witnesses, not trembling hands beside her. Eduardo spent the morning treating the meeting like a victory already won. He ordered Fielding to prepare a proposal generous enough to look noble and cruel enough to keep Marina dependent: temporary alimony, a smaller residence, mutual silence, her removal from all administrative involvement, and a custody arrangement that would leave him broad decision-making power over the child. Fielding tried to warn him to avoid any reference to the incident in the sub-basement. Eduardo waved him off, impatient, saying he knew his wife better than anyone. Marina, in his mind, had too much pride to expose herself publicly and too much fear of losing the baby to risk a scandal. At the hospital, Helena was fighting her own quiet battle. That morning she'd been summoned informally by the clinical director, who mentioned anonymous complaints about inappropriate conduct in Marina's care. The accusation was vague, the way most cowardly weapons are, hinting at excessive emotional involvement, a breach of hierarchy. Helena listened without over-explaining, knowing long justifications tended to look like guilt. She simply asked that any further questions come in writing, with the complainant identified and the facts described objectively. The director looked away. Men trained in pressure rarely liked paperwork. Raphael was called in by Walter Briggs the same day. The conversation happened near the service garage, away from the main cameras, though not far enough from Raphael's own caution. Walter asked if he had a family, if he liked his job, if he understood the difference between loyalty and insubordination. Raphael felt real, physical fear, a cold, damp kind that settled into his spine. Still, he answered that his loyalty belonged to the hospital as an institution, not to any individual executive's personal wishes. Walter laughed low and said institutions didn't sign termination letters. Raphael walked back to the tech office with his hands clenched. Camila watched all of it unfold from a small administrative office, pretending to sort reports while catching fragments of conversation and increasingly clipped messages from Eduardo. He no longer called her sweetheart. He used her full name when he wanted obedience, and irresponsible when he wanted somewhere to dump his panic. The night before, Fielding had floated the idea of pinning the document removal on her as an isolated, unauthorized act. Since then, Camila had started guarding her phone like a weapon. It held messages, short recordings, and every promise Eduardo had made believing desire could also buy silence. Marina arrived at the hospital just before 5, dressed in dark blue with low, sensible shoes. Her advanced belly stood in quiet contrast to the calm on her face, and a few staff members looked away, guilt or curiosity, it was hard to tell which. She walked slowly, feeling every step echo against the floor that had once watched her fall. The main corridor looked the same. Nothing about it felt the same. Where there had once been routine, there was now memory. Helena met her near the elevators, feigning coincidence, and asked about her blood pressure. Marina said it was within range. Helena nodded, but her eyes said be careful. The private conference room sat on the 6th floor, behind pale wood doors and walls lined with framed photos from the hospital's charity campaigns. Eduardo liked that room because it turned financial decisions into acts of benevolence. When Marina walked in, she found Eduardo, Fielding, and an empty chair positioned to face them both. No water glass for her. No real concern. Just theater dressed as negotiation. Eduardo rose with a calibrated smile, offering to help her sit. Marina declined with a small gesture and chose a different chair, slightly outside the angle he'd arranged for her. Fielding opened with lines about family protection, confidentiality, and maturity. Marina listened in silence, hands resting on her belly, face neutral. The lawyer laid out a proposal that might have sounded comfortable to anyone who didn't know how to read handcuffs. Marina would receive 2 years of covered housing, full medical support, and financial compensation, provided she left the hospital immediately, surrendered her company devices, and signed a written statement acknowledging the fall as accidental, caused by stress and fatigue. Eduardo kept his expression sorrowful throughout, as if every clause were sacrifice rather than purchase. Marina asked if the proposal also required her to forget Laura Bennett. The name entered the room like cold air under a door. Fielding stiffened. Eduardo took a breath and for a moment, dropped the grieving husband act entirely. He said that had nothing to do with their marriage. Marina tilted her head and said maybe their marriage had never really been separate from the hospital at all, since he used the exact same tools in both places. Control. Secrecy. Punishment. Fielding asked for objectivity. Marina agreed. She asked what value Eduardo placed on staying silent about the shove. Eduardo walked straight into it, not out of stupidity, but out of contempt. He believed he could say anything and later deny it with the help of context, lawyers, and power. He leaned in, fingers pressed against the dark tabletop, and said that one moment of tension didn't define a whole life, and that Marina had no right to destroy an institution employing hundreds of people over it. He added that Camila had only left with administrative documents to avoid improper exposure. Marina held his gaze. His voice hardened further. He said she should be grateful there was even a proposal on the table. In the tech office, Raphael listened through headphones alongside a detective assigned by Sophia and a digital forensics specialist, all authorized to monitor the exchange. His heart sped up the moment Eduardo said the word shove. There was no celebration in the room. Just the feeling of a door finally coming loose from its frame. Sophia, elsewhere in the city, received the secure transmission and took notes with a calm that had teeth in it. Partial confessions didn't stand alone, but paired with the footage, Camila's messages, and the medical records, they formed a spine that would be very hard to break. Marina pressed forward carefully. She asked if Eduardo expected her to raise their son under the supervision of a man who'd knocked her down to protect his mistress. Eduardo lost the last of his patience. He said she was exaggerating everything, that the child needed stability, that a mother, consumed by resentment, could make dangerous decisions. The sentence came out exactly as she'd predicted. He wanted to turn her courage into a diagnosis. Marina felt a small pull of pain and rested her hand on her belly, but refused to let it distract her. She asked if stability meant obeying him. Fielding tried to pause the meeting, sensing too late that Eduardo was saying far more than necessary, but Eduardo raised a hand, silencing him. That single gesture, small and instinctive, revealed the real hierarchy between lawyer and client. He turned to Marina and said she had never understood the weight of managing lives, money, reputation, and politics. He said Laura Bennett had been a tragedy, but tragedies needed to be contained before they became fires. He said grieving families were easy to manage with the right lawyers. Marina felt sick. She stayed still. His cruelty, for the first time, was speaking without polish. Outside, Camila had come up to the 6th floor without being summoned. She didn't walk in. She stood partly hidden behind the corner wall and heard enough to understand exactly what Eduardo was willing to sacrifice. When he called Laura's death a contained tragedy, Camila's hand tightened around the phone in her pocket. She remembered Laura's mother clutching a photo of her grandchildren while signing the settlement. Back then, Camila had told herself it was just paperwork, just mediation, just survival. Now she understood Eduardo would call anything just business, as long as someone else paid for it. Marina placed a copy of Eduardo's proposal on the table and said she wouldn't be signing it. Fielding scooped the document up too fast, but she kept talking. She explained that her priority was her son, and because of that, she would never let him be born into a lie. Eduardo laughed without humor. He asked if she really believed one isolated video could bring down years of reputation. Marina said she didn't believe it. She knew it, because the video wasn't isolated anymore. For the first time, real fear crossed his face, brief, ugly, unguarded. And before he could gather himself enough to threaten her again, the conference room door opened without a knock. Sophia walked in first, flanked by the detective and 2 identified officers, all calm, all deliberate. Eduardo went pale, then erupted into offended professionalism, demanding to know what kind of intrusion this was. Sophia presented the preservation order, covering documents, devices, and records tied to the Laura Bennett case, the 3rd sub-basement incident, and everything connected to Marina Vidal. Fielding closed his eyes for one long second, understanding the disaster in full. Marina stayed seated. Not triumphant. Just exhausted. Her son shifted inside her, a reminder that victory still had to be survived. Eduardo tried to turn the room into a stage. He shouted about persecution, conflict of interest, marital revenge. He accused Sophia of acting out of some old grudge against the Vidal family. She let him talk, because men like him tended to hand over material the moment they thought they were defending themselves. Then she informed him that every statement would be formally logged, along with the comments already captured during a lawfully monitored meeting. Eduardo looked at Marina. There was no husband's mask left on his face. Just hatred. "You have no idea what you just did," he said. "I do," Marina answered. While the officers sealed files and collected devices from the administrative suite, the hospital sank into a quiet kind of panic. Directors called their lawyers. Coordinators deleted messages that meant nothing, not realizing the act itself now looked suspicious. Nurses exchanged glances somewhere between relief and fear. Walter tried to leave through the service garage and was stopped for questioning about his conversations with Raphael and prior requests for footage access. Helena, summoned again by the clinical director, walked in this time with a copy of her own notes and the name of her attorney already in hand. The balance was shifting sides, slowly, with the creak of old metal. Camila was found sitting on a bench in the 6th floor corridor, pale, her practiced composure gone. When Sophia approached, she didn't try to smile. She said she had information, but she wanted protection. Sophia told her that cooperation didn't erase responsibility and that any deal would depend on the complete truth. Camila nodded, eyes filling with tears that came too late to matter, and handed over her unlocked phone. Inside were messages from Eduardo directing the removal of documents, recorded audio about settlements with families, orders to pressure staff, and one devastating line where he said his pregnant wife would learn to know her place. Marina wasn't in the room for that part. Helena had pulled her out the moment she noticed her going pale, mild contractions starting under the stress. In a private recovery room, Helena told her to breathe slowly and, for a few minutes, Forget the case, the crimes, the board, Eduardo. Just patient and baby. Marina obeyed, frightened for the first time that day. Courage didn't cancel out a body. Justice didn't replace care. When the monitor steadied, she cried from sheer exhaustion. Helena held her hand and told her no truth required her to destroy herself to be valid. Marina kept that sentence like medicine. Eduardo was suspended that same night, though not yet arrested. The board, which had shielded him with silence for years, discovered how quickly institutions abandoned people once shame turned into a financial threat. Fielding recommended limited cooperation. Eduardo accused him of incompetence. At home, surrounded by unanswered messages, he threw a glass against the wall and stood staring at the pieces as if they were evidence of an injustice done to him. He didn't think about Marina on the floor. He didn't think about his son. He thought only about the fact that someone had dared to take the pen out of his hand and stop him from writing reality himself. At Celeste's house, Marina came home late, supported by Helena and Raphael, met by her mother with a mixture of relief and terror. There was no celebration. Celeste made tea. Raphael explained little. Helena recommended full bed rest. Marina lay in her childhood room, listening to soft rain against the window, aware that the worst wasn't necessarily over. A wounded Eduardo would be more dangerous than a confident one. Still, something essential had shifted. The truth no longer belonged to her alone. It lived now in copies, in transcripts, in phones, in official orders, in hands that couldn't all be bought at once. Before sleep took her, Sophia sent one short message. The investigation was formally open. The evidence would be forensically reviewed. A preliminary hearing could come within days. Marina read it and set the phone on her chest. She didn't feel triumph. She felt the weight of every family that might finally understand why they'd been silenced. She felt sadness at having once loved a man capable of calling a shove a detail, a death a contained tragedy, and control, stability. Then she felt her son move, firm, like an answer. Marina closed her eyes. The floor where she'd fallen was no longer the end of the story. It was only the first piece of evidence. The first hearing didn't carry the dramatic shine Marina had imagined during her sleepless nights. It happened in a plain room with hard chairs, stacks of documents, and voices trained to sound neutral over broken lives. Eduardo arrived in a dark suit, flanked by two attorneys, beard trimmed, chin lifted, looking less like a man on trial than an executive annoyed by a scheduling delay. Marina came in afterward, leaning on Helena, followed by Celeste, wearing a calm on her face that had cost her many hidden tears to build. Sophia laid out the evidence methodically. First, the footage from the third subbasement, time-stamped and forensically authenticated. Then Camila's messages, the access logs to Laura Bennett's file, the attempted camera lockdowns, and Helena's clinical notes. Eduardo watched with a rigid face, as if the mere repetition of the truth was a personal insult. When the shove appeared on the screen, Marina didn't look at him. She looked at herself falling, and understood, with a strange ache, that the woman on that floor was no longer who she was anymore. Eduardo's lawyer tried to shrink the video down to an unfortunate moment inside a marital argument. He used words like intention, privacy, deteriorating marriage, rushed interpretation. Sophia didn't argue emotion. She had the forensic analyst walk through the body's motion, the camera angle, everything before and after the shove. Then she asked why Camila had left the room carrying unauthorized documents at the exact moment Marina tried to call security. The defense hesitated. The room went quiet. Sometimes the truth didn't need to shout. It just needed the lie to stop being able to breathe. Camila testified late in the afternoon, wearing a pale dress that gave her an air of borrowed innocence. She cried before answering the first question, but Sophia waited until the tears stopped being useful. Camila confirmed she'd received direct orders from Eduardo to remove files, approach vulnerable families, and speed through confidentiality settlements. She admitted Laura Bennett hadn't been the only one, though she tried to present herself as a frightened subordinate rather than a willing participant. Marina listened without visible hatred. Somewhere far off, there was pity, but no forgiveness. Camila had chosen again and again to obey, because obedience had brought her status, money, and proximity to power. Laura Bennett's mother appeared at the second hearing. Mrs. Teresa Bennett walked in with a plain purse in her lap and a photograph folded inside an envelope. She spoke softly, but every word seemed to cut straight through the courtroom's glass windows. She described how Camila had arrived with flowers, comfort, and paperwork, saying the hospital wanted to spare the family further suffering. She described signing without fully understanding, because she was burying a daughter and raising 2 grandchildren who kept asking when their mother was coming home. Eduardo lowered his eyes for the first time. Not from remorse, Marina thought, from recognizing that the victim's face was damaging his case. Other families followed. A husband who'd lost his wife to a medication mix-up. A son who'd received a confusing report about his elderly father. A nurse who'd watched records vanish and was transferred to the night shift the moment she asked questions. Each testimony added weight to what had first looked like a story about infidelity and domestic violence. Somerset Grace wasn't just a backdrop. It was a machine. And Eduardo had learned to move its human gears with the same coldness he used to sign contracts. Marina felt the responsibility growing inside her alongside her son, like a second pregnancy. Eduardo kept trying to preserve his image. In short interviews, his lawyers spoke of cooperation, composure, confidence in the justice system. Behind the scenes, he hunted for people to blame. He called Camila an opportunist, Walter incompetent, Fielding weak, Raphael a traitor. He never once found a word for himself. When he learned the board had voted for his permanent removal, suspending his bonuses, his access, his privileges, he sat locked in his old office for hours. The room that once obeyed his expensive cologne and low, commanding voice now sealed with evidence tags on every drawer. For the first time, power didn't part the way when he approached with his badge. Marina followed most of it from a distance. Helena had restricted her hearings and appointments. Her body demanded rest with an authority even courage couldn't argue down. Some nights she woke sweating, feeling the cold floor against her side all over again. Other nights she dreamed of Camila walking endless corridors with Laura's box in her arms, while Eduardo smiled in front of cameras that had gone dark. Celeste stayed close, reading old novels aloud in a low voice, the way she used to when Marina was a girl. Her mother never asked if she still hurt over Eduardo. She already knew she did. She also knew pain wasn't the same thing as longing. Labor began on a stormy pre-dawn morning, 3 weeks early. Marina woke to steady contractions and a strange, almost supernatural calm. Helena was called immediately, and the drive to a maternity hospital outside the Somerset Grace network felt endless. Celeste prayed without moving her lips. Raphael, who'd insisted on driving, kept his eyes locked on the road with total concentration. Marina breathed the way Helena had taught her, holding her mother's hand, thinking that after all the documents, cameras, and testimonies, the moment had finally come for something no strategy could control. Life was arriving. Miguel was born at sunrise, small, strong, and furious at the world, as if protesting everything that had tried to reduce him to a bargaining chip before he'd even drawn breath. His cry filled the room like a bright, defiant verdict. Marina cried when they laid him on her chest. There was no triumph in it, only a gratitude so large it felt almost like grief. Helena smiled behind her mask, eyes wet. Celeste touched her grandson's feet like she was confirming a small, solid miracle. For a few minutes, Eduardo, Camila, the hospital, and every open case stayed outside the edges of the universe. There was only skin, breath, and a name finally spoken out loud. Eduardo learned about the birth through his lawyers. A protective order barred him from any direct contact with Marina. He requested permission to visit his son, citing paternal rights and family remorse. The request was reviewed carefully, but the circumstances weighed heavily against him. Marina took no comfort in the restriction. There was a real sadness in imagining Miguel growing up with a father he'd first know through legal filings. Still, she understood that limitless compassion could become one more open door for abuse. Motherly love, she was learning, wasn't handing a child a pretty family. It was giving him real safety. The forensic findings arrived in the following weeks. The footage was intact. The charts of Laura Bennett and several other patients had been altered after adverse events. Invoices pointed to diverted funds through vendors tied to directors loyal to Eduardo. Camila cooperated enough to expose the network, but not enough to escape her own choices. Walter admitted to pressuring Rafael on Eduardo's behalf. Fielding tried to distance himself, claiming he'd only handled the marital crisis, but internal records showed he'd known far more than that. Marina's fall had cracked open a corridor of corruption. The Somerset Grace Board announced a public restructuring, driven by the investigation, press coverage, and pressure from victims' families. Directors were removed. Contracts suspended. External audits launched. For the first time, the hospital was forced to listen to the people it had once silenced with settlements. Teresa Bennett joined a reparations committee, bringing Laura's photograph to every meeting. Rafael was given formal protection and later invited to lead a new integrity and technology division. Helena, cleared of every internal complaint against her, was appointed to coordinate protocols for patients affected by violence. None of it brought anyone back. But some of it kept new losses from happening. Marina gave her formal deposition when Miguel was 40 days old. She carried him into the building for a few minutes before handing him to Celeste. Eduardo was present, but thinner now, stripped of the easy, luminous confidence he used to wear like a second surname. Seeing her, he tried to hold the wounded husband expression, but found instead a woman who no longer fit the role of guilty wife. Marina described the fall, the marriage, the attempts at financial control, the threats aimed at their son, and the culture of impunity Eduardo had cultivated long before that morning in the subbasement. She spoke without theatrics, which made it devastating. When it was his turn, Eduardo tried one final version. He said he loved Marina, that he'd lost control, that corporate pressure had worn him down, that Camila had manipulated him. He spoke of fatherhood as though it could clean the record before it even started. Marina watched him without interrupting. In every sentence, she saw a man trying to survive not through truth, but by trading one mask for another. Sophia asked if he acknowledged shoving Marina to prevent Camila from being caught with the documents. Eduardo went silent. In that room, silence was almost a confession. Camila testified late in the afternoon, wearing a pale dress that gave her an air of borrowed innocence. She cried before answering the first question, but Sophia waited until the tears stopped being useful. Camila confirmed she'd received direct orders from Eduardo to remove files, approach vulnerable families, and speed through confidentiality settlements. She admitted Laura Bennett hadn't been the only one, though she tried to present herself as a frightened subordinate rather than a willing participant. Marina listened without visible hatred. Somewhere far off, there was pity, but no forgiveness. Camila had chosen again and again to obey, because obedience had brought her status, money, and proximity to power. Laura Bennett's mother appeared at the second hearing. Mrs. Teresa Bennett walked in with a plain purse in her lap and a photograph folded inside an envelope. She spoke softly, but every word seemed to cut straight through the courtroom's glass windows. She described how Camila had arrived with flowers, comfort, and paperwork, saying the hospital wanted to spare the family further suffering. She described signing without fully understanding, because she was burying a daughter and raising 2 grandchildren who kept asking when their mother was coming home. Eduardo lowered his eyes for the first time. Not from remorse, Marina thought, from recognizing that the victim's face was damaging his case. Other families followed. A husband who'd lost his wife to a medication mix-up. A son who'd received a confusing report about his elderly father. A nurse who'd watched records vanish and was transferred to the night shift the moment she asked questions. Each testimony added weight to what had first looked like a story about infidelity and domestic violence. Somerset Grace wasn't just a backdrop. It was a machine. And Eduardo had learned to move its human gears with the same coldness he used to sign contracts. Marina felt the responsibility growing inside her alongside her son, like a second pregnancy. Eduardo kept trying to preserve his image. In short interviews, his lawyers spoke of cooperation, composure, confidence in the justice system. Behind the scenes, he hunted for people to blame. He called Camila an opportunist, Walter incompetent, Fielding weak, Rafael a traitor. He never once found a word for himself. When he learned the board had voted to suspend his access, his privileges, and his salary pending the outcome of the case. He sat locked in his old office for hours, the room that once obeyed his expensive cologne and low, commanding voice now sitting half-sealed with evidence tags on certain drawers. For the first time, power didn't part the way when he approached with his badge. Marina followed most of it from a distance. Helena had restricted her hearings and appointments. Her body demanded rest with an authority even courage couldn't argue down. Some nights she woke sweating, feeling the cold floor against her side all over again. Other nights she dreamed of Camila walking endless corridors with Laura's box in her arms, while Eduardo smiled in front of cameras that had gone dark. Celeste stayed close, reading old novels aloud in a low voice, the way she used to when Marina was a girl. Her mother never asked if she still hurt over Eduardo. She already knew she did. She also knew pain wasn't the same thing as longing. Labor began on a stormy pre-dawn morning, 3 weeks early, right in the middle of the recess between hearings. Marina woke to steady contractions and a strange, almost supernatural calm. Helena was called immediately, and the drive to a maternity hospital outside the Somerset Grace network felt endless. Celeste prayed without moving her lips. Raphael, who'd insisted on driving, kept his eyes locked on the road with total concentration. Marina breathed the way Helena had taught her, holding her mother's hand, thinking that after all the documents, cameras, and testimonies, the moment had finally come for something no strategy could control. Life was arriving, whether the case was finished or not. Miguel was born at sunrise, small, strong, and furious at the world, as if protesting everything that had tried to reduce him to a bargaining chip before he'd even drawn breath. His cry filled the room like a bright, defiant verdict of his own. Marina cried when they laid him on her chest. There was no triumph in it, only a gratitude so large it felt almost like grief. Helena smiled behind her mask, eyes wet. Celeste touched her grandson's feet like she was confirming a small, solid miracle. For a few minutes, Eduardo, Camila, the hospital, and every open case stayed outside the edges of the universe. There was only skin, breath, and a name finally spoken out loud. Eduardo learned about the birth through his lawyers. A protective order, issued during the ongoing proceedings, barred him from any direct contact with Marina. He petitioned immediately for supervised visitation, citing paternal rights and family remorse, timing the request for maximum sympathy in front of the same board members still deciding his fate. The petition would take weeks to be reviewed. Marina took no comfort in the delay. There was a real sadness in imagining Miguel growing up with a father he might first know only through legal filings. Still, she understood that limitless compassion could become one more open door for abuse. Motherly love, she was learning, wasn't handing a child a pretty family. It was giving him real safety, even if safety meant waiting. 2 weeks after Miguel's birth, with Marina barely back on her feet, Sophia called with news that changed the shape of everything ahead. The forensic audit of Somerset Grace's finances had turned up something bigger than anyone on the prosecution's side had expected, a pattern of diverted funds running not just through Eduardo's office, but through a shell vendor network tied to his father's old associates, some of them still sitting on hospital boards across the state. Laura Bennett's case and Marina's fall weren't the end of the rot. They were the loose thread that, once pulled, was unraveling something much older and much larger than one bad marriage. Sophia said the case was about to expand, and that meant Eduardo's lawyers would fight twice as hard, because now there was far more than one man's freedom on the line. Marina looked down at Miguel, asleep in her arms, and understood that the danger she'd walked out of that hospital corridor to escape hadn't ended with his birth. It had only just started showing its real size. The news settled over Celeste's house like a second storm. Sophia explained it plainly the next morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she never touched. The forensic auditors hadn't just found irregular invoices tied to Eduardo's signature. They'd found an entire network, vendors that didn't exist beyond a mailing address, contracts renewed automatically for services no one could verify, and payments that routed, through 3 shell companies, back to a name Marina hadn't expected to see again. Alarcón Medical Holdings. Her father-in-law's old company, technically dissolved 11 years earlier, but apparently still breathing under a different name, with 2 current Somerset Grace board members listed as silent partners. Marina sat with that for a long moment, Miguel asleep against her shoulder. She had spent months believing she was untangling one man's crimes. What Sophia was describing now was a structure, something built over decades, something that had likely survived worse scandals than this one, quietly, because nobody had ever pulled hard enough on the right thread. Eduardo hadn't invented the rot. He'd inherited it and made it worse. That changed the math for everyone. Sophia warned that with more money and more names at risk, Eduardo's legal team would stop playing defense. They'd go looking for leverage, anything that could discredit Marina, delay proceedings, or muddy the narrative enough to make a jury or a review board hesitate. She told Marina to expect private investigators, expect old friends suddenly resurfacing with agendas, expect anything even slightly imperfect in her own past to be magnified into a weapon. "You mean he'll come after me again?" Marina said. "Not a question. He'll come after everyone who can hurt him," Sophia answered. "You're just at the top of the list." Raphael felt it first. 2 men he didn't recognize showed up outside his apartment building on a Tuesday evening, sitting in a gray sedan with tinted windows for nearly 3 hours. They didn't approach him. They didn't need to. The message was clear enough just from being seen. He called Marina that night, voice tighter than she'd heard it since the day of the fall, and told her he was moving the last of his personal files off every device he owned, just in case someone decided a technical error needed to happen to his equipment. Helena's trouble came dressed as bureaucracy. A formal review board meeting was scheduled, not the vague concerns from before, but an actual disciplinary hearing, citing supposed irregularities in how she'd documented Marina's case. Helena recognized the maneuver immediately. If they could get her credibility as a physician officially questioned, every clinical note she'd written about Marina's injuries could be challenged in court as unreliable. She spent 2 sleepless nights preparing a defense of her own record, while still finding time to check in on Marina and Miguel by phone every evening, refusing to let the pressure show in her voice. Camila's situation grew more dangerous in a different direction. With the case widening to include the Alarcón network, her cooperation suddenly made her far more valuable and far more exposed. 2 nights after Sophia's call, Camila's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen. Her laptop was left untouched on the desk, but every drawer had been opened, every folder gone through, as if someone wanted her to know they'd been there. She called Sophia in a near panic, insisting she needed protective custody, that she'd told Eduardo things over the years that other people, bigger people, would not want repeated in a courtroom. Sophia arranged it within the day. What Camila revealed once she felt safe enough to keep talking made even the prosecutor go quiet on the phone. Camila said the diverted funds weren't just paying for silence around patient deaths. They'd been paying for years to keep a state health inspector quiet about violations that should have shut down 2 entire wings of Somerset Grace long ago. She gave a name. She gave dates. And she said that inspector was still active, still employed, still signing off on annual safety reports that any honest audit would have flagged as fiction. If that was true, it meant the danger at Somerset Grace hadn't stopped with Laura Bennett. It meant patients were still, right now, walking into a building that had been certified safe by a man who'd been paid to lie. Marina didn't sleep that night. She sat in the nursery with Miguel against her chest long after he'd drifted off, staring at the wall, thinking about every family that had trusted that hospital's polished lobby, its careful lighting, its calm nurses, never knowing the numbers behind their safety had been quietly bought. The next morning, a courier arrived at Celeste's house. No return address. Inside a plain envelope was a single photograph, Marina, taken from across the street, walking Miguel in his stroller through the neighborhood 2 days earlier. No note. No threat spelled out. Just the photograph and the unmistakable message underneath it. "We know exactly where you are." Celeste's hands shook as she held it. Marina's didn't. She had expected something like this eventually, she just hadn't expected it to arrive with her son's stroller in the frame. She called Sophia immediately. Sophia's voice, usually so controlled, carried an edge Marina hadn't heard from her before. "I need you to listen to me carefully," Sophia said. As of this morning, this isn't just a custody case or a fraud case or an assault case anymore. It's bigger than Eduardo. And that means it's more dangerous than Eduardo ever was on his own. Marina looked down at the photograph again, at the small, unmistakable shape of her son's stroller, and understood that the war she thought she'd already survived had only been the opening move. Sophia arrived at Celeste's house within the hour, along with a detective Marina hadn't met before, a quiet, methodical woman named Grace Whitfield, who specialized in cases involving institutional corruption and witness protection. Grace examined the envelope without touching the photograph directly, sliding it into a clear evidence sleeve with practiced hands. "No postmark," Grace said. "Hand-delivered. Which means whoever sent this wanted you to know they didn't need the mail system to reach you." Marina held Miguel a little tighter. "So what does that mean for us?" "It means we're not waiting for the next hearing to make changes," Grace said. "Effective today, you and your son are relocating to a secured residence. Your mother too, if she's willing." Celeste didn't hesitate. She was already moving toward the hallway to start packing before Grace finished the sentence. Marina resisted for exactly one moment, some old, stubborn instinct telling her that running felt like losing, before Helena's voice came back to her, clear and steady in her memory. "No truth requires you to destroy yourself to be valid." Staying visible wasn't bravery if it put Miguel in danger. It was just pride wearing bravery's coat. She agreed. The safe house was modest, a rented two-bedroom on the edge of the county, unremarkable from the outside, alarmed and monitored on the inside. Raphael was relocated too, along with a promise of protection extended through the DA's office once his cooperation was formally logged. Helena couldn't disappear the same way. Her patients needed her, and pulling her out of circulation would have raised exactly the kind of questions Somerset Grace's remaining loyalists would love to exploit. Instead, she was assigned a discreet security detail and told to vary her routine, which she did, grimly, joking that she'd spent 15 years learning to save lives and now had to learn how to not get followed doing it. Camila, already under protective custody, kept talking. Grace and Sophia spent 4 straight days debriefing her, piecing together a timeline that reached back further than either of them had expected. The paid inspector's name was Dennis Okafor, a man who had signed off on Somerset Grace's safety certifications for 9 consecutive years. 2 of those years included documented equipment failures in the surgical wing that should have triggered automatic suspensions. They hadn't. Camila remembered delivering an envelope to Okafor personally, twice, always at Eduardo's instruction, always in a parking garage 2 blocks from his office. When Grace's team quietly pulled Okafor's financial records under a sealed warrant, they found deposits that lined up, almost to the day, with Camila's memory. It wasn't just Eduardo anymore. It was a system with multiple hands holding it up, and every hand that got exposed made the remaining one's grip tighter. Eduardo, still confined by the protective order and now facing a board that had frozen his authority pending trial, felt his options narrowing in a way that made him reckless. He reached out to his father's old attorney, a silver-haired fixer named Preston Aldana who had quietly cleaned up a Larcone family messes for 3 decades. Preston's advice was simple and cold: stop playing defense, start manufacturing doubt. Find something, anything, in Marina's history, her mental state, her judgment, that a jury could hang a reasonable doubt on. Discredit the mother, and the case built around her testimony gets shakier with every headline. Within a week, a story appeared in a local paper, sourced to individuals close to the Vidal family, suggesting Marina had a history of anxiety and postpartum complications that several colleagues worried had affected her judgment in recent months. No names. No direct quotes. Just enough smoke to make casual readers wonder if the woman accusing a respected hospital executive of assault might not be entirely reliable. Marina read it in the safe house kitchen with Miguel asleep in the next room, and felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. "They're not even trying to be subtle anymore," she said. Sophia, on speakerphone, didn't sugarcoat it. "They don't have to be subtle. They just have to be loud enough, long enough, to plant one seed of doubt in 12 strangers' minds. That's the whole strategy now." Marina looked at the photograph Grace had bagged as evidence, still sitting in her mind's eye even though the real one had long since been logged into a case file. She thought about Laura Bennett's mother sitting in that hearing room with a folded photograph of her own. She thought about every family the paid-off inspector's silence had put at risk without their knowledge. She thought about Miguel, sleeping without any idea yet of the storm his birth had walked into. Then she thought about something else, something that made her sit up straighter at the kitchen table. Camila mentioned a parking garage, Marina said slowly. 2 blocks from Okafor's office. Did anyone check if that garage has cameras? There was a pause on the line. Then Sophia's voice again, sharper now, more alert. Say that again. If Eduardo had Camila deliver bribes in person, on a schedule, in the same location, that's not just Camila's word anymore. That's a pattern. Patterns leave footage. Parking garages keep footage for years if nobody's ever had a reason to pull it. Grace was already reaching for her phone before Marina finished the sentence. 2 days later, the answer came back, and it was better than any of them had dared hope. The garage's management company had upgraded its security system 18 months earlier and kept a full digital archive going back 3 years. Grace's team pulled every frame from the dates and times Camila remembered. What they found wasn't just Camila handing over envelopes. It was Eduardo himself, twice, meeting Dennis Okafor face to face. No intermediary, no plausible deniability. Just the hospital's CEO and its bot inspector, standing together in a concrete stairwell, shaking hands like men closing a deal. Sophia called Marina within the hour, and for the first time since this had all begun, there was something in her voice that sounded almost like relief. He just handed us the whole case, she said. He was so sure nobody would ever think to look at a parking garage that he walked right into frame. Twice. Marina closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, feeling the tight coil in her chest loosen for the first time in days. But relief, she'd learned, never lasted long in this fight. Because that same afternoon, Grace's office received a call that stopped everyone cold, a call from the district attorney's own staff, warning that someone inside the DA's office had been quietly asking questions about Sophia's caseload, about Grace's assignment, about exactly how deep the Somerset Grace investigation was allowed to go. Someone with access to the inside of the very office prosecuting Eduardo Vidal was reporting back to him. Sophia didn't say anything for a long moment after Grace relayed the warning. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into something flatter, more careful, the sound of a woman recalculating every conversation she'd had in that building over the past several weeks. How deep? She asked. We don't know yet, Grace said. Could be a clerk feeding information for money. Could be someone higher. Until we know, we treat every filing, every hearing date, every piece of evidence we've logged as potentially compromised. Marina, listening from the safe house with Miguel on her lap, felt the ground tilt again in that old, familiar way. So he could already know about the garage footage. We have to assume he does, Sophia said, which means we move faster than he expects, not slower. That night, Grace's team quietly transferred the most sensitive pieces of evidence, the garage footage, Camila's full statement, the financial trail tied to Okafor, out of the district attorney's shared systems and into a sealed, standalone file only Sophia, Grace, and one federal liaison had access to. It meant slowing down the paperwork trail on purpose, creating a visible gap that would look, to anyone watching from inside, like the investigation had stalled. It was bait, and everyone understood it as one. 3 days later, the bait worked. A junior records clerk named Peter Solano was seen leaving the courthouse and getting into a car registered to a shell company Grace's team recognized immediately, one layer removed from Alarcón Medical Holdings. Solano had access to filing schedules, hearing calendars, and evidence logs. Not the sealed file itself, but enough surrounding information to tell Eduardo's people where pressure might still find a crack. Grace didn't move on him immediately. Instead, she let him keep believing he was invisible, feeding him a piece of false information about a supposed weakness in Camila's testimony, a claim that Camila had recanted part of her statement under stress. If that leaked back to Eduardo's camp and they acted on it, it would prove exactly how the information was traveling. It took 4 days. Then Preston Aldana, Eduardo's father's old fixer, made a call to a contact at a tabloid outlet, offering an exclusive, suggesting the prosecution's star witness was falling apart. The story ran the next morning under a vague, unnamed source's headline. Grace had her confirmation. Solano was arrested within the week, and under the threat of his own obstruction charges, he gave up the name of the person who'd been paying him, a name that led, unsurprisingly, straight back to Preston Aldana, and through him, to Eduardo. It was one more felony added to a growing list, but more importantly, it closed the leak. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, Marina, Sofia, and Grace could speak freely again without wondering who else was listening. Eduardo, cut off from his inside source and now facing new charges for witness tampering and obstruction, grew visibly smaller in the courtroom over the following sessions. The confident tilt of his chin softened into something more brittle. His lawyers stopped promising acquittal in hallway interviews and started using words like mitigating circumstances instead. Fielding had quietly withdrawn from the case weeks earlier, unwilling to have his name attached to a client who kept generating new charges faster than old ones could be resolved. His replacement, a younger attorney with far less patience for Eduardo's instincts, spent most of every session trying and failing to keep his client from speaking out of turn. The trial proper began in early spring. Marina testified first, walking the courtroom through the third subbasement corridor step by step, the folder, the archive room door left open, the shove, the fall, and everything that had unraveled in its wake. She kept her voice level even when opposing counsel tried, twice, to suggest her account had evolved conveniently alongside the expanding case. She answered both attempts the same way, by pointing back to the video which had never changed, never needed correcting, and had been telling the same story since the very first morning. Camila testified again, more fully this time, walking the jury through the parking garage meetings, the settlement negotiations with grieving families, and the moment she'd finally understood that Eduardo would sacrifice anyone, including her, to protect himself. Her voice cracked once, describing the message she'd sent Marina from a locked bathroom stall, "You'll never prove it without the files that disappeared," and admitting, under oath, that she'd sent it hoping to scare a woman she now understood had never actually been as powerless as Eduardo had convinced her to believe. Dennis Okafor took a plea deal rather than testify, admitting to 9 years of falsified safety inspections in exchange for a reduced sentence and full cooperation. His statement alone forced Somerset Grace's remaining board to shut down 2 wings of the hospital for emergency safety recertification, a decision that made front-page news and, for the first time since the fall in the subbasement, put real institutional weight behind everything Marina had been trying to prove for months. Raphael testified about the footage, the mirrored server, the deletion requests filed in the months before Laura Bennett's death. Helena testified about the injuries, the bruising pattern, the timeline that never matched an accidental fall. Teresa Bennett testified again, this time joined by 2 other families whose cases had come to light through the widening investigation, a wall of grief that no defense strategy could soften into misunderstanding. Through it all, Eduardo sat at the defense table, watching the case that had once seemed like a marital inconvenience metastasize into something that would follow him for the rest of his life. On the final day of testimony, before closing arguments, he leaned toward his attorney and asked, quietly enough that only the court reporter's microphone caught it in full, whether there was still any way to make this go away. His attorney didn't answer. He just closed his folder. That night, back at the safe house, Marina sat with Miguel by the window, watching headlights pass on the road outside, waiting for closing arguments and a verdict that would decide not just Eduardo's future, but how much of the truth the world would finally be allowed to keep. Closing arguments began on a gray Thursday morning, the kind of pale, flat light that made the courtroom feel smaller than it was. Sofia stood first, moving without notes, because by then she didn't need them. She walked the jury back through the timeline one final time, not as separate crimes stacked on top of each other, but as a single continuous choice, made over and over, by a man who had learned that money and charm could rewrite almost anything. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply laid the pieces down in order, the shove caught on camera, the deleted files, the paid inspector, the bribed clerk, the anonymous smear campaign, the photograph of Marina and her son left on a doorstep as a warning, and let the jury see, all at once, what it looked like when one man's fear of consequences became a system built to protect him from ever facing any. He didn't lose control that morning in the sub-basement, Sophia said. Losing control would almost be forgivable. What the evidence shows is a man who has never once, in 9 years, faced a consequence he couldn't buy, threaten, or quietly erase, until the one morning a camera caught him before he could. The defense's closing was shorter, and noticeably less confident than it had been at the start of the trial. Eduardo's new attorney tried to draw a line between the assault charge and everything that had grown up around it, arguing that a marital altercation had been opportunistically expanded into a sprawling conspiracy case that unfairly punished his client for other people's separate decisions. It was a technically competent argument. It also asked the jury to believe that a hospital CO photographed shaking hands with a bribed safety inspector, whose fixer had bribed a courthouse clerk, whose mistress had delivered years of hush payments on his direct orders, had simply been unlucky enough to know a great many criminals independently of himself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Marina spent them in a small side room with Celeste and Miguel, unable to eat, unable to focus on anything longer than a few minutes at a time. Helena stopped by twice between patients, just to sit with her in silence. Raphael texted every hour, not with news, because there wasn't any yet, but just to say he was still there, still waiting with her. Sophia didn't come by at all. She was pacing somewhere else in the building, Grace told them later, the way she always did before a verdict, as if movement could speed up time. When the bailiff finally called them back in, Marina felt Miguel's weight in her arms like an anchor, the only thing keeping her upright as she walked to her seat. The verdict came back on every count. Guilty of assault against a pregnant person. Guilty of obstruction of justice. Guilty of document fraud. Guilty of witness tampering. Guilty of conspiracy to commit bribery. The jury foreman read each finding in the same flat, procedural tone, and each one landed on the courtroom like a separate stone dropped into still water. Eduardo didn't react the way Marina had once imagined he might, in the private, angry fantasies she'd never admitted to anyone. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He simply sat very still, staring straight ahead at nothing, as if some part of him had already left the room and only his body remained behind to hear the rest. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to file their final statements. In the interim, the board of Somerset Grace voted unanimously to terminate Eduardo's employment and strip him of every remaining title, a formality by that point, but one Marina found she still needed to hear read aloud. Camila, whose full cooperation throughout the trial had been documented and weighed by the court, received a reduced sentence with mandatory restitution to the affected families and a permanent bar from working in healthcare administration. Dennis Okafor's plea deal held. Preston Aldana was indicted separately, on a wider set of charges connecting Alarcón Medical Holdings to at least 2 other hospitals under a still expanding investigation that Sophia warned would likely take years to fully untangle. Somerset Grace itself did not escape unscathed. The state health department suspended its accreditation pending a full independent review, and 3 more wings closed for inspection alongside the 2 Okafor's confession had already condemned. The reformed ethics committee Marina would eventually join didn't yet exist in any formal sense. It existed only as a set of demands she and a handful of others were already drafting, refusing to let the hospital reopen fully until real, enforceable safeguards were written into its bylaws, not just promised in a press release. The night of the verdict, Marina sat on the back steps of the safe house with Miguel asleep against her chest, the porch light off, the sky unusually clear for early spring. Celeste sat beside her, saying nothing, just present the way she'd been present through nearly every hard night of the past year. "It's not over," Marina said quietly, not quite a question. "No," Celeste agreed. "But it's not the same anymore either." Marina thought about that distinction for a long time after her mother went inside. Not over, there would be sentencing, appeals, years of civil litigation, years of Miguel growing up and eventually asking questions she'd have to find some careful, honest way to answer. But not the same. The lie that had once controlled every door in her life no longer had the strength to close a single one. Her phone buzzed once against her leg. A message from Sophia, sent late, uncharacteristically short for a woman who usually wrote in careful, complete sentences. Sentencing hearing scheduled. You'll want to be there for this one. It's not just about Eduardo anymore. Marina frowned at the screen, a small unease moving through the calm she'd only just started to feel. She typed back a single question, "What does that mean?" and watched the 3 dots appear, disappear, and appear again, as if even Sophia wasn't sure how to say it simply. The reply came through a few minutes later, and it wasn't the kind of thing Sophia liked to explain over text. She asked Marina to come by her office the next morning instead, in person, before the sentencing hearing, just the two of them, no Grace, no Raphael, nothing official on the record yet. Marina left Miguel with Celeste and drove to the courthouse annex alone for the first time in months, feeling strangely exposed without the small, warm weight of him against her chest. Sophia was waiting with 2 cups of coffee neither of them would finish and a thin folder she kept her hand flat on top of, like she wasn't quite ready to let Marina see what was inside it yet. During sentencing, Sophia said, the judge is going to factor in victim impact statements. Yours, obviously. But also new ones, filed in the last 10 days, once Okafor's plea went public and people realized the investigation was real and safe to talk to. New victims, Marina said. New victims. 2 more deaths tied to falsified inspection reports going back further than we first thought, before Laura Bennett, not after. And something else. Sophia finally opened the folder and turned it around so Marina could read the top page herself. A name that came up in 3 separate statements this week. Someone who worked directly under Eduardo's father, years before Eduardo ever took over as CEO. Someone who's still alive. Still connected. And who Camila swears, in a supplemental statement she gave 2 days ago, personally trained Eduardo in exactly how this whole system worked. The settlements, the inspector, all of it. Before Eduardo ever built anything himself, he inherited a functioning machine and a mentor who taught him how to run it. Marina read the name at the top of the page and felt something settle into place that she hadn't realized was still unsettled. A shape the last year had been circling without ever quite naming. Arthur Vidal. Eduardo's father. Officially retired for over a decade, quietly celebrated at hospital galas twice a year as a beloved former chairman. His photograph still hanging in the lobby beside a plaque praising his vision and integrity. He's the reason none of this ever got caught before, Marina said slowly. Eduardo didn't invent the cover-up system. He just kept the family business running. That's what we believe now, yes, Sophia said. Which means the sentencing hearing isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of a second case, bigger and older than the one we just won. And Arthur Vidal has spent 40 years learning exactly how to stay 2 steps outside of anything that could ever touch him. Marina sat with that for a long moment, turning the folder's single page over in her hands, thinking about the lobby photograph she must have walked past 1,000 times without ever really looking at it. A kind, silver-haired man smiling down at everyone who passed beneath him, exactly the way Eduardo used to smile at dinner parties before she'd learned what that particular smile was worth. Does he know we're looking at him yet? She asked. We don't think so. Not yet. Which is the only advantage we have. Sophia closed the folder. But Marina, I need you to understand what I'm asking. You've already given a year of your life to this. You have a son who needs you whole, not worn down to nothing chasing one more name on one more folder. If you want to walk away after sentencing, hand everything else to Grace's team and let them build the next case without you, no one, not me, not Helena, not Raphael, would think less of you for it. Marina looked down at her own hands, steady now in a way they hadn't been in the archive room over a year ago, and thought about Teresa Bennett holding her daughter's photograph up in a courtroom like a shield and a sword at once. She thought about the 2 new families whose names she didn't even know yet, the ones the falsified reports had cost long before Laura Bennett ever walked into that operating room. She thought about Miguel, asleep at Celeste's house, growing up in a world where a man's photograph could hang in a hospital lobby for 40 years while people quietly died under a system he'd built to protect himself. I'm not walking away, Marina said. But I want to do this one differently than the first time. Different how? Last time, I found out by accident. I opened a door I wasn't supposed to open and reacted to whatever was on the other side of it. This time, I want to walk in already knowing exactly what's there. I don't want another fall in another corridor before we finally have enough to stop him." Sophia almost smiled, the first real one Marina had seen from her in weeks. "That," she said, "sounds like something a lawyer would say." "I am one," Marina said. "I just spent a year forgetting that I got to use it for myself too." The sentencing hearing took place 3 days later. The gallery was fuller than it had been for any single session of the trial. Reporters, hospital staff, several of the families who'd come forward once the case became public knowledge. And in the front row beside Celeste, Helena and Raphael sitting shoulder to shoulder, the same small alliance that had formed in a basement corridor over a year earlier now sitting in open daylight with nothing left to hide. Marina read her victim impact statement without notes, the way Sophia had taught her to argue a closing months ago, not from paper, but from memory, because the truth didn't need to be read off a page to be believed. She spoke about the fall, and the silence that had followed it, and the year of small, careful, unglamorous work it had taken to turn that silence into something loud enough for a courtroom to finally hear. She spoke about Miguel, and about every family whose name she now knew, and about the ones whose names she was only just beginning to learn. She did not mention Arthur Vidal. Not yet. That name, and everything underneath it, would wait for its own case, its own careful year of quiet work. The judge sentenced Eduardo to 18 years, with the possibility of parole after 12, plus a lifetime ban from any position of authority within a licensed healthcare institution. It was not the number Marina had privately hoped for in her darkest, angriest moments over the past year. It was, Sophia told her afterward, close to the maximum the law actually allowed once every charge was weighed together, which meant it was, in its own unglamorous, procedural way, as close to enough as the system could offer. Eduardo was led out of the courtroom in restraints, and for the first time since the morning in the subbasement, he looked directly at Marina before the doors closed behind him. There was no charm left in his face. No performance for the room. Just a kind of blank, furious disbelief, the expression of a man who had never once, in his entire life, imagined a version of events he couldn't eventually rewrite in his own favor. Marina held his gaze until he was gone. That evening, back at Celeste's house, her own house again now, since the safe house was no longer needed and the threats around her had, for the moment, gone quiet, Marina sat on the back steps with Miguel in her lap, watching him reach for the porch light with small, determined hands, utterly unconcerned with courtrooms or verdicts or lobby photographs of silver-haired men. Her phone buzzed once. Sophia again. 3 words this time, no explanation needed. "Ready when you are." Marina looked up at the lit window where Celeste was humming something old and half-remembered in the kitchen, down at her son reaching for the light with everything he had, and typed back a single word before setting the phone face down beside her. "Ready." The second case took 11 months, and this time Marina walked into it already holding a map instead of stumbling through the dark with a folder pressed to her chest. Grace's team built the paper trail first, old board minutes, retirement packages that looked more like severance for silence than reward for service, a decades-long pattern of settlements signed under Arthur Vidal's chairmanship that mirrored, almost line for line, the ones Eduardo had later learned to sign himself. Camila's supplemental statement gave them the shape of it. 2 retired hospital administrators, tracked down by Raphael through old employment records nobody had thought to seal, gave them the rest. Men in their 70s now, tired of carrying a silence they'd never wanted in the first place, willing finally to say, on record, who had taught them exactly which words to use and which files to lose. Arthur Vidal did not go quietly. He hired the best defense money could still reach, gave 2 syrupy interviews about persecution and family tragedy, and tried, for a while, to paint Marina as a grieving daughter-in-law lashing out at an innocent old man because she couldn't reach the son who'd actually hurt her. It didn't work the way it might have a year earlier. There were too many names by then. Too many families standing behind Marina instead of watching from a distance. Teresa Bennett appeared at his arraignment without being asked, simply because she wanted him to see her face. He was convicted on 11 counts. Conspiracy, bribery, obstruction spanning back further than the statute of limitations should have technically allowed, except that Sophia had found a way to tie the older crimes to newer, ongoing cover-ups that kept the whole architecture legally alive. He was 74. The sentence, when it came, amounted to the rest of his life, and for once, the number didn't need qualifying. It was enough because there was no more time left for it to need to be. Somerset Grace did not survive as Somerset Grace. Under state receivership, stripped of its accreditation for the better part of a year, it reopened eventually under new ownership and a new name, with an ethics charter that Marina had spent months helping draft, tamper-proof archiving, independent audit rights, a protected reporting channel with real teeth behind it, and a fund, seeded by the civil settlements from both Vidal cases, set aside specifically for families whose cases had been quietly buried in the years before anyone thought to. Teresa Bennett sat on the fund's oversight board. So, eventually, did Raphael, who left hospital security work behind entirely and built a second career auditing exactly the kind of systems he'd once been ordered to lock down. Helena stayed in obstetrics, though she added something new to her practice, a standing arrangement with the county's Domestic Violence Advocacy Center, a quiet referral line for patients who came in with injuries that didn't quite match the story they were telling. She never talked about why she'd started it. She didn't need to. Anyone who knew her well enough to ask already knew the answer. Camila served 4 years. When she came out, she didn't try to re-enter healthcare, didn't try to re-enter anyone's good graces by way of apology tours or careful public statements. She moved to another state, took a job doing something quiet and administrative that had nothing to do with hospitals, and once, only once, sent Marina a short letter, not asking for forgiveness, just saying that she hoped Miguel was growing up well, and that she thought about Laura Bennett's mother more than she thought about almost anything else. Marina read it once. She didn't answer it either. Some doors, she had learned a long time ago, didn't need slamming. They just never had to open again. Eduardo wrote twice more from prison over the following years. Marina read the first letter and not the second. By the time the third arrived, she'd stopped opening them altogether, not out of anger anymore, but because she'd noticed, somewhere in that second year of her new life, that she'd simply run out of room in her days for him. He wasn't a wound she was managing. He was a chapter she'd finished, filed, and set on a shelf she rarely needed to reach for. Miguel turned 5 on a bright, ordinary Saturday, in a backyard that belonged to Marina now, a small house 2 streets over from Celeste's, close enough that his grandmother could walk over for dinner most nights, far enough that it was undeniably Marina's own front door, her own hallway light, her own name on the deed. Helena came, older now, a little grayer, still laughing the same unguarded laugh she'd first shown Marina in a basement corridor. Raphael brought his own daughter, born 2 years earlier, who immediately declared Miguel her best friend and refused to leave his side for the rest of the party. Sophia came late, as always, still awkward around balloons and cake, still wearing, without meaning to, the particular warmth she reserved only for the handful of people she'd fought hardest beside. Teresa Bennett came too, as she did every year now, without needing an invitation. She brought Miguel a small wooden truck, sat with him on the grass while he crashed it through an army of ants, and told Marina, quietly over lemonade, that she still thought about that first phone call, the one where Marina had asked if Camila had said the same gentle things to her that she'd said to Marina in a hospital hallway once. Teresa said she used to think that question had been about building a case. Now she understood it had been about something else too, about a stranger deciding, in the middle of her own fall, that Laura's death mattered as much as her own survival did. That evening, after the guests had gone and Miguel had finally, reluctantly, fallen asleep with a fistful of half-melted birthday cake still on his fingers, Marina stood in his doorway for a long moment, the hallway light throwing a soft gold line across the carpet. She thought about the woman who had walked into a cold, forgotten corridor a lifetime ago, certain of nothing except that something in that gray folder mattered more than her own comfort. She thought about the floor. She thought about the camera overhead that had refused to lie for anyone, and the handful of people, a doctor, a technician, a mother, a prosecutor, a grieving stranger with a photograph in an envelope, who had refused to let a powerful man decide, alone, what the truth was allowed to be. She was not the same woman who had fallen that morning. She had not become someone hard, or someone armored, the way she had half expected to, somewhere in the exhausting middle of all of it. She had simply become someone who trusted her own account of her own life again, who no longer flinched even slightly when she remembered the sound her hand had made against that tile floor, because the sound didn't own her anymore. It was just a fact now, filed alongside all the others, true and finished and no longer able to reach into the present and pull her back down. Miguel shifted in his sleep, murmured something wordless, and settled again, one hand curled loosely near his face the way it had been curled against her chest the very first morning of his life, back when the whole world outside that delivery room had still been a war she hadn't finished fighting. Marina reached in and switched off the hallway light. She didn't linger in the doorway the way she once might have, half waiting for some old fear to catch up with her in the dark. There was nothing left back there that could. She walked to her own room, closed her own door, in her own house, at peace, certain, finally, that some victories didn't need to be loud to be real. They only needed, in the end, someone who refused to stop telling the truth, for exactly as long as it took the world to finally start listening. Miguel turned 5 on a bright, ordinary Saturday, in a backyard that belonged to Marina now, a small house 2 streets over from Celeste's, close enough that his grandmother could walk over for dinner most nights, far enough that it was undeniably Marina's own front door, her own hallway light, her own name on the deed. Helena came, older now, a little grayer, still laughing the same unguarded laugh she'd first shown Marina in a basement corridor. Raphael brought his own daughter, born 2 years earlier, who immediately declared Miguel her best friend and refused to leave his side for the rest of the party. Sophia came late as always, still awkward around balloons and cake, still wearing, without meaning to, the particular warmth she reserved only for the handful of people she'd fought hardest beside. Teresa Bennett came too, as she did every year now, without needing an invitation. She brought Miguel a small wooden truck, sat with him on the grass while he crashed it through an army of ants, and told Marina, quietly over lemonade, that she still thought about that first phone call, the one where Marina had asked if Camila had said the same gentle things to her that she'd said to Marina in a hospital hallway once. Teresa said she used to think that question had been about building a case. Now she understood it had been about something else too, about a stranger deciding, in the middle of her own fall, that Laura's death mattered as much as her own survival did. That evening, after the guests had gone and Miguel had finally, reluctantly, fallen asleep with a fistful of half-melted birthday cake still on his fingers, Marina stood in his doorway for a long moment, the hallway light throwing a soft gold line across the carpet. She thought about the woman who had walked into a cold, forgotten corridor a lifetime ago, certain of nothing except that something in that gray folder mattered more than her own comfort. She thought about the floor. She thought about the camera overhead that had refused to lie for anyone, and the handful of people, a doctor, a technician, a mother, a prosecutor, a grieving stranger with a photograph in an envelope, who had refused to let a powerful man decide, alone, what the truth was allowed to be. She was not the same woman who had fallen that morning. She had not become someone hard, or someone armored, the way she had half expected to, somewhere in the exhausting middle of all of it. She had simply become someone who trusted her own account of her own life again, who no longer flinched even slightly when she remembered the sound her hand had made against that tile floor, because the sound didn't own her anymore. It was just a fact now, filed alongside all the others, true and finished and no longer able to reach into the present and pull her back down. Miguel shifted in his sleep, murmured something wordless, and settled again, one hand curled loosely near his face the way it had been curled against her chest the very first morning of his life, back when the whole world outside that delivery room had still been a war she hadn't finished fighting. Marina reached in and switched off the hallway light. She didn't linger in the doorway the way she once might have, half waiting for some old fear to catch up with her in the dark. There was nothing left back there that could. She walked to her own room, closed her own door, in her own house, at peace, certain, finally, that some victories didn't need to be loud to be real. They only needed, in the end, someone who refused to stop telling the truth, for exactly as long as it took the world to finally start listening. If this story moved you, don't scroll away just yet. Somewhere right now, there's a Marina, a Helena, a Raphael, someone quietly gathering the courage to stop staying silent. If this story reminded you why that courage matters, hit like, drop a comment telling me which character you'd have wanted in your corner, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the light, send this one their way.